We don't need more screenwriters watching who are students of 20th century film. We need film writers who have had real experiences. And that's actually, when you look at the filmmakers who came out of the Second World War, that was a period that threw everyone's life into chaos, We were forced to reevaluate everything they'd previously experienced. They were put into life and death situations that were completely foreign to them, and created, ironically, this massive burst of completely authentic, felt, emotional experience,
Why do we tell stories? What is their purpose?
Oh, look, there's been a lot written about this. Look, the purpose, I guess, is to extract meaning from life. I've actually present a little sort of 20-minute video on YouTube about how to make films. You'll find it under johncollee.com. And I point out in that, we are actually awash with stories at the minute. That, any sporting competition will give you characters to identify with, moments of high and low, kind of unknown results. But there's something very specific about writing stories where you can actually insert exactly the piece of meaning that you want into a piece of fiction. And my central thesis in that little podcast is that that's actually the whole point of filmmaking, that we draw people into a story, we create a dream. It's a little bit like Chris Nolan's notion of Inception. You create a dream which the audience then enter. They find in that someone they identify with so closely that they imagine themselves as that person, and they learn the life lessons that that person is learning in the course of the story. I think that's what we do, and often these life lessons are both paradoxical and complex. They're too complicated to just distill into, a single page of wisdom. You have to actually experience the journey, and then you come out wiser from it. And I think that's how stories work.
When figuring out what those bits of meaning are to put into your story, is that something you start with in the beginning of the process? Like, I want to write a story and I want to have this as the meaning, or does the meaning emerge over time throughout the process?
I think it emerges as you're writing it, and suddenly, you might be into third or fourth draft of a story and go, that's what it's about. And suddenly it changes everything. And it's kind of magical when that happens, because you go, oh, now I know what I'm writing about. And often if you track writers' careers, like, I've been writing now for 30 years, you can track your own career and see that you're actually writing about the same thing in different ways a whole lot of the time. But it's the same binary, it's the same paradox that you're wrestling with, And it's also true that the audience, in experiencing your story, will derive a different and a more personal piece of meaning from it than you intended to implant in it, So you're going, okay, for me, this story is about this. This is going to be my North Star. This is how I'm going to direct the narrative. And then someone like yourself will watch it and go, actually, what I took from that story was this. And I found that deeply personal and meaningful, in which case you go, oh, of course, that's what I was intending all along.
Why then do you need to set out with the intention of adding meaning if people will come to their own conclusions about what the meaning is on their own?
Because a really well-told story, I would argue, and really classic films have a meaning that is so specific, it's so intentional. It jumps out at you and it endures, I once read this wonderful analysis of why classic art, which I'm a fan of, is more profound than a lot of abstract art. And the writer there, which he was writing about art criticism, but he was arguing that the true test of an artist is intentionality. How, to what extent did you intend that emotional effect, I mean, there's a picture behind me there. It's just a copy from the Sistine Chapel, but Michelangelo, when he designed that picture, everything about it, all the hidden meanings, all the references, but also the emotional effect was absolutely specific. You look at Rembrandt's self-portrait, and there's a little highlight in the pupil of his eye, and that single brushstroke was absolutely intentional, and the emotional effect of that brushstroke is intended and transmits across the centuries. So that's what you're looking for, I think, as an artist and as a creator. You actually want to be so in control of the medium that you can transmit a really complex idea, a really complex notion with all its kind of paradoxes and its nuances. You can transmit that to the next generation. That's what you kind of aim for, and it's a really high bar, and it's why we generally don't achieve it.
Do you feel stories today are losing their meaning?
Look, I think there's a lot of meaningless writing that goes on. I think there's a whole generation, or a whole raft of screenwriters who are kind of good enough to create a story that kind of has the sort of thrill of a roller coaster ride, but doesn't actually amount to anything. There's been a lot of slamming of Marvel movies, and I don't want to jump on that bandwagon, but it's certainly true that, some of these movies are just pastiches of movies that came before. They're not actually written with any kind of philosophical understanding of life. They're not really written with any intention to transmit anything very profound. They're just written to entertain you for 2 hours. And you go, well, that's actually very easy. It's easy to shock and make people laugh a bit. But to actually affect them emotionally, to write a story that they will go back to again and again because it's somehow nurturing, that's a really hard ask. And I don't think most Marvel movies kind of reach that bar.
Do you think part of it is also storytelling by committee? And I think that I look at that as a different thing from like working in a collaboration with a couple people to craft a story, but versus a committee where you have a group of people wanting to see different things in the film. So now you have a writer trying to pull in all these meanings and ideas from different people and trying to fit them all into one story.
Yeah. Oh, look, we've all worked in writers' rooms, and it does actually work very well as long as you're all seriously intentioned. I think where these processes fall down is where it's being driven by the bean counters, and they kind of, okay, this one sells, that one sells, we know we can get money for this. It's kind of, that's bollocks. It's like, what is the intention? What is you've got to dig deep into yourself to write a really good show or a film or a series. Really good writers are very rare. When you get a room full of them, it's a delight. It's actually fantastic. It's like playing kind of chess with real masters. And when you're all kind of focused with a kind of same laser-like intention on transmitting the same ideas in your story, then that works really well. But often it happens through a single voice or a single imagination.
When was a time you were in one of those rooms where it's yourself and a bunch of other master storytellers?
Oh, look, you're making a podcast about George Miller, and certainly some of the times working with George, and we would have around ourselves a bunch of artists, storyboard artists, advisors. I mean, technical people who kind of knew the world that we were writing about. Even on something like Happy Feet, it said, we had a lot of serious-minded, zoologists and Antarctic experts advising on that show. And even though, it's kind of, the show is disguised as just kind of fluffy family entertainment, but it does actually contain quite a lot of profundity in it, I think. I think it worked really well. I think it does endure. That was great fun. Working with Peter Weir on Martian Commander, of course, he's just he's sort of like a Zen master of storytelling, Peter. I mean, the interesting thing with Peter was that he completely rejects the whole sort of Hollywood notion of the five-act structure, which I'm totally in love with. I love the structure of stories. I love discussing the structure of stories. And I love the mathematical perfection of a really good story. Peter rejects all of that. He reckons it all has to come out of your subconscious, and that so his approach is quite different from mine. It's basically just to kind of dream the world, dream the story, and see what pops into your subconscious. And I'm constantly kind of, and when we were collaborating together, I was constantly trying to structure this into blocks. Okay, this is our first act, this is our second act, and strangely, that clash of techniques actually worked out really well. We did end up with a story that satisfied both of us. And of course, the unsung third partner in that was the author of the books, who kind of Patrick O'Brien, who created this whole world that we could just dive into and take all sorts of authentic detail from. And so that was a great kind of, in a way, a three-way collaboration.
I was going to ask what that specific collaboration taught you, especially because he is, like you said, so free flowing in his approach. Especially, I think it's on your website. You describe Master and Commander as the story you'll be remembered for, which is both a blessing and a curse. And so I'm curious, like, what that taught you about screenwriting, I guess, or storytelling.
Yeah, interesting. Just to kind of let it go, and sometimes the idea you most resist is the idea that you're looking for. That's an interesting thing. I mean, the ending of that film was actually it's thought up by Peter quite late in the piece, but already had two or three drafts. Russell was already on board. We were in pre-production, and Peter went, "I've got the ending," and we had up to I can't remember where it went after Maturin is shot on the ship. And Jack has to. This is basically the fourth act climax. Jack, in my in my analysis, Peter would say, "Oh no, don't bother with acts and climaxes. No, no, no. It's just something that happens." Anyway, Jack gets shot. So Maturin gets shot. Jack Aubrey has to abandon his quest and take him to the island that he like for the whole voyage. Jack Aubrey has been kind of rejecting the kind of the pleas from Maturin to sort of like, please stop this voyage, abandon this nonsense, this revenge quest you're on, and just let's go and explore the world and let's see a little bit of natural history here. And so finally, because of this accident, Jack is forced to comply to his friend's wishes. And this is a story about, I guess, thematically, it's a story about these two paradigms of manhood: the man of action and the man of contemplation. That's the central conflict of the film. And classically, in film structure, you get to the end of your fourth act, and the kind of, and the hero, your hero in this case, I guess Jack Aubrey, is forced to completely rethink his approach to life, which indeed he is, because he loves Maturin so much as a friend that he finally abandons the one thing that he most wants, which is revenge against the pirate ship, the Acheron. And in doing so, he finds the thing that he wants. I mean, that's a classic kind of, fourth act reversal in a movie. And Peter came up with it. He said, I've got it. He takes him to the island, and while Maturin is recovering, Jack allows him to go botanizing, and Maturin goes botanizing, and he finds the pirate ship, and then they use their scientific and military skills to defeat it. And it was the perfect ending. Peter, again, King, I mean, I would have been laboring away to find what is structurally the meaning of this film, what is structurally the perfect ending to it, in that kind of left brain logical way. Peter basically just dreamt it. I had an idea, he rigs up, I had an idea. When they get to the island, he goes up botanizing and he finds the ship. And then they join forces to sort of defeat it. And they both become each other in that final climax. Maturin picks up a sword and becomes a fighter. And Jack, in order to kind of lure the pirate ship closer to them, learns from Maturin's kind of botanical studies and realizes that disguise is the key. So it's like the two kind of warring partners in this love story kind of finally merge.
I think what's so interesting about kind of your differing approaches, you and Peter, is the fact that even though Peter is working from this like free place with no structure, he naturally ends up with a form of structure that you can see in the way he tells stories. Like it's naturally an undercurrent there the whole time, anyways.
And that happens so often, when you're resisting an idea, and you finally kind of allow yourself to go, oh, wait, that is the idea. That's what I've been looking for. I had another one when I was writing this kind of adventure story about an Aboriginal freedom fighter, a guy called Jandamara. The advisor on that had been asking me to think more and more about Aboriginal religion, and I went, no, I don't want to write religion. I'm writing Robin Hood here. But of course, the story about the Aboriginal freedom fighter ends in tragedy. He dies, and in the Aboriginal way of thinking about death. That is not a finality in the Western way of thinking about things. When you die as an Aboriginal, you basically just step across a boundary into the spirit world. It's a liberation in a way. You're still there. You're just a spirit. You become a tree and a bush and a rock and a mountain. You become part of the natural world. And so, in fact, religion was the transformation I'd been looking for. And I've been resisting and resisting it all through sort of plotting that story and finally go, oh, fuck, you're right. You're right. And it's watching The Matrix that suddenly brought that home to me. There's another dimension. He enters the other dimension. That's the ending. And the white people who are kind of hunting him down don't realize that he's won, that he's become, sort of invincible and eternal.
And so more often than not, when you realize that the idea you're resisting is the correct one, does it kind of just hit you like a bolt of lightning and you go, oh, or is there like a process you can go through to try to kind of get there?
No, you struggle and struggle with your left brain, and then suddenly your right brain presents it. I think all of us as writers have got we've all had that experience of waking up with the idea. It just means that your subconscious has been processing it while your conscious mind is wrestling with it. And sometimes you just have to find a way of switching off your conscious mind, which is why people go walking or canoeing or climb a mountain or, do something else completely different, which is a great excuse for work avoidance, but it also sometimes works.
Do you ever just write freely? Because I know you, from my understanding, you don't like to start with the beginning of a screenplay and just start writing it. Like you like to fully kind of structure it out.
Well, and that's a way of kind of tricking myself into doing my 5 or 10 pages a day, because that's the hardest thing, sitting down with a blank sheet of paper is the hardest thing, just writing freely, Graham Greene, the novelist, says he used to write 500 words a day, and that was a good day, if you get your 500 words down, and you do have to exercise that writing muscle, don't you? If you stop writing for a long period, it's like lying in bed for a long period, you find your muscles aren't working, so you do have to do it all the time, even if you're producing stuff that isn't terribly satisfying. The stuff that I find easiest to write is story outlines, because I don't need to kind of get into the dream and actually, imagine every little detail of the scene I'm writing about. I can just deal with the big blocks of action. And I think it was, I saw a masterclass by Salman Rushdie where he said, when in his advice to novelists, he said, write a story without adjectives. In other words, just write about action. Just write about who does what. Even if it's a emotional action or a psychological action, it's still an action. Just who is doing what to whom. And that's what I start with. So I write, here's the plot. I'm writing a 6-part at the minute, and I'm starting with the plot. What are the blocks? What's the timeline? What are the blocks of who does what? Is each of these blocks going to take me on to the next block? Will it logically lead to that thing? And will there be a hook at the end of it that makes me need to read that next thing, And then once you've got that framework, then great. Firstly, what your research has to be. I mean, you're doing research all the time, but once you specifically nail down, here are the kind of the blocks of story that I'm telling, then it makes research much more specific. Now I need to know how that lawnmower works, or I need to know how, whatever.
I've heard other screenwriters talk about how the characters will kind of guide them through the story. Like the characters will take turns they hadn't expected. Do you ever experience that in your process, especially when like you've laid the whole story out, you know where it's going? Do you ever get halfway through and the character's trying to take you a different direction?
Look, I don't do that much because I tend to kind of tell the characters where to go more. But look, it is true that you think you're writing one plot and then suddenly you have a new idea, and maybe that's talking about the same thing. You go, well, what if they didn't do that? And so one way to think of story is as the branches of a tree. You your end point, which you often think of quite early. I want to take audiences to there, to get to that, they have to make this choice here. They have to make this choice here. There's a series of choices that have to get, So you're writing Indiana Jones and the Raise of the Lost Ark. And at some point, they got to get the box. They got to get the Ark of the Covenant. At some point, they got to open it and find out what's inside. And whatever is inside has got to be transformed. So you start off writing that story. Okay, how's he going to get the arc? And part of your job as a screenwriter is to make getting that thing much more difficult. So to get this, first you got to do that. So there are all these stages that you can start to kind of block out. And look, it is true that somebody, and you might say this is the voice of your character, and somebody says at some point, what if he doesn't get the arc? What if the story is all about him failing to get the arc? Or what if he gets the arc and never finds what's inside it? I mean, I think that would be a less satisfying story, but yeah, I guess that's true. That once you start speaking to your characters, then they speak back. My kids, I work here on the top floor of the house, and my kids, when they lived with us, would would complain about, because they're in the bedrooms below, and they complain about, first of all, Dad, you're thumping too hard on the typewriter, and secondly, and you're talking to yourself again. And this is you do that. Once you get into the writing of the dialogue, which is a really fun part of writing a screenplay, you're kind of you're talking in all the voices, and they're talking back, and they're sometimes saying things you didn't expect.
There was a story I heard once. It was one of these like pulpy noir writers. I don't know if it was Elmore Leonard or Ray Bradbury, but they were writing a story once and they became distraught because someone came in and shot the main character as they were writing, and their story was over because they couldn't go back and undo that. The story was done and he was distraught that the story he's working on was just over. Because that's where the story led. I think of that often when I ask that question.
We talk about your left brain, your and your right brain. So your left brain is designing these stories as a kind of, and they are like a really well designed story, is like a Swiss watch. You can't actually take many parts out of it, or any parts out of it. When it's perfect. Occasionally you can completely redesign the thing while you're writing it. Yeah, and actually, when I'm writing. And all scripts go through multiple drafts. So I'll after I've written a draft, I'll write a synopsis of what I've written. And I write the synopses quite carefully, and I write the drafts quite kind of quickly in order to just listen up. You're thinking about this story. And sometimes what you write is not what you had in the synopsis. And so then, that came out of my head when I was trying to follow that course. So now you write what you've actually written. And sometimes that's different from what you intended to write. So I'm constantly flipping back between the synopsis and the draft synopsis. It's really, really hard in fact, it's impossible to rewrite a full screenplay. It's 30,000 words and everything affects everything. And so you just get into a mess, and you can actually, we all know people who have spent not just months, but years trying to rewrite screenplays by fiddling with each scene and then realizing that, wait a minute, scene 3 so affects scene 105. It just becomes wrestling and spaghetti. And so you've got to distill it into something that makes logical sense every time. Every time you get a draft, you have to distill it back into something that is a logical progression, and then look at that quite carefully and go, actually, this script isn't saying what that said, it's saying this. And so I'll write that into synopsis. And then if that's better than what I had, then I'll rewrite it. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about like this synopsis process? Like what exactly are you writing in that synopsis? What does that document look like?
It's usually 10 pages, and it's usually predicated on the fact that I think films consist generally of 2 or 3 minute sequences, the bit where, the bit where, the bit where. So I'll give each of these a heading, and I'll write sort of 30 or 40 of these in a 100-minute screenplay. And you often, when if you're adapting a novel or you're working off a heap of research, and I usually start with just a ton of books on the subject that I'm writing about, and then I start writing cards about, here's an interesting little snippet from the book. Here's a scene from the book I'm adapting. Here's a snippet of history from the thing that I'm writing about. And these cards, and when you come across one of them, you come across a scene and you go, oh my God, yeah, definitely got to have, Napoleon's first meeting with Josephine. That's definitely got to go in, So, okay. And that'll be a card, and it'll be all these different cards that will kind of, that'll start lining up at your desk. And of course you end up with like 100 of them when you only need 40. And then you start refining the cards. And then each of these cards becomes a 3-minute sequence. But so, as I say, yeah, the 5 or 10 pages list of 3-minute sequences that are going to make up this story. And then, of course, each of these sequences, because you'll be thinking about it and you'll be conflating stuff, you'll be saying, oh, these 3 sequences can actually all be done with that sequence. So the sequences will be, you'll be finding out stuff about each of these little components as you're researching and writing it. And so ideally, you'll end up at the end of that process, which is a lot of research and thinking, but you'll end up at the end of that process with, 30 or 40 chapter headings, the bit where, the bit where, the bit where. Initially, a paragraph on each one, and then each of these paragraphs becomes a page, and each, and so when you come to actually write the screenplay and put it in dialogue, you'll have a 30 or 40 page, really detailed synopsis of your story with bits of dialogue scattered through it, But yeah, so my central thesis is that you don't start a story. I'm going to start at the beginning and write whatever comes into my head. You start with kind of like a concept of the story, and you expand it, expand it, expand it.
And did you say you're doing this synopsis document after each draft as well to kind of recalibrate?
Yeah.
So it's just redoing that process in between each draft?
Often there's the minor changes, but sometimes there's major changes, And that thing you started off talking about meaning, and one of the great insights that I got, I think it was from the Robert McKee course, was that meaning is emotion. That when you get a script back and the producer says, I'm not feeling anything, it's because the meaning of the story isn't clear, And the meaning has to be kind of so embedded that, it's designed not to be clear, but you need to know what the meaning of this story is. If they read it and go, I'm not feeling anything, it's a meaningless story. It's because you haven't actually decided for yourself where this story, what the top branch of the tree you're leading towards is, And so going back to Raiders of the Lost Ark, that seems like just a gripping yarn. It seems like just another adventure story. It's actually, for me, the Raiders of the Lost Ark is a very profound story about the centrality of spiritualism in the life of a guy who starts off being a kind of unfaithful lover and a tomb raider, and basically, he's this single piratical guy who roams around the world. And in order to get the thing he's after, the Ark of the Covenant, first of all, he has to reconcile with his lover who's abandoned, and then he has to go through all these trials and tribulations. Finally, what he discovers is that spirituality is real. He starts off just kind of blithely stealing, Aztec, holy objects, and so running away from the tribe who own it, but he ends up opening the box and finding, oh my God, all this stuff is real. And interestingly, in that final scene, he's tied to a pole with a woman who he loves, and so it's like it becomes a marriage ceremony. It becomes like this kind of spiritual blessing on a union. So it's feel like that film is so full of. I mean, I think it's a work of art, but it fools you into thinking you're watching an adventure story while delivering something quite profound, and that's the trick. And that's why the final scene is emotional. It's like you've actually learned something despite yourself. You've transformed as a person, and you come out of that film believing in marriage and believing in love and believing in spirituality. I mean, I'm sure there's other ways of reading that film, but that's what it did to me.
Did you get to speak with Stephen about how you view the film when you were working on Bismarck?
No, I didn't. In fact, we had, the Bismarck that was a great project. Stephen normally has half a dozen projects running simultaneously. And when I was running the Bismarck project, it was suggested we had a couple of meetings early on. And then I think by the time I'd finished a draft that was really, in my mind, really good, he'd moved on to make other things. And so, yeah. So I didn't get to speak to him about Raiders, but at some point.
You mentioned how oftentimes when like a producer, someone's reading a script and they say they're not feeling anything, it's because you're unclear on what the meaning is. And I think it was in your first or second answer today, you said sometimes you're just in the third or fourth draft and you go, this is what the meaning is of this. Kind of a two-pronged question is one, how can you do you have to just wait for the meaning to hit you like an epiphany, like when you're in the middle of a draft? Or can you systematically identify it? And then two, once you've identified the meaning, how do you then bring that into the future drafts of the script?
Look, that's really interesting. I've been working on this story for Phil Noyce about the war in Tobruk, and the bad way to do the war in Tobruk is just to write, a bunch of battles, soldiers fighting. Phil had this great story about his mum and dad meeting the day before his dad shipped out to basic training. They met and had a one night stand, and he said, "I'll marry you when I come back." And she said, "Yeah, that's going to happen." He goes off to war. And the war is just hell. It's like a series of battles in which one by one his whole platoon basically get wiped out, and they're stuck in these trenches with German tanks coming at them and Stukas bombing them. And so it's traumatic and horrible. And what Phil said when he was describing the story to me was, but this memory of my mother and the thought that he would come back to her was what kept him alive, like he had something to live for. So I started off writing that story as, okay, they meet, he falls in love with Philly, they have a one night stand, he goes off to war, he comes back, she's waiting at the dockside to get married. Okay, the end of story. That's a really uninteresting way to tell the story. But if you think about what Phil had described, and that actually, this idea came after watching Dunkirk, in which Chris Nolan does, as always, that wonderful thing he does with time. The idea that time frames can operate simultaneously, different time frames. And so, okay, let's take a 24-hour one-night stand, the story of two people falling madly in love, and let's weave it through all the battle scenes, so that actually that gives you naturally the kind of highs and lows that you want in a movie, but it also somehow captures the meaning of the film, that our lives are relative, time is relative, that a single period of 24 hours can have the same positive value as a year of war has negative value. That's a really important meaning to take into your life, the idea that if you have a sufficiently intense experience and you value that experience for what it is, that that can outbalance all the shitty things that happen subsequently. If you can hold that in your heart, then it's like a bulletproof vest. Now that's a really profound meaning, but you can only understand it by experiencing it. So the challenge then was to write a film that actually showed how this love affair kind of kept him alive, basically. There's something to retreat into, something to aim for, the return to aim for, the da da da. And so I think that is now in the draft. I'm really happy with that script, but you kind of arrive at it by wrestling with structure and then thinking of structure and meaning at the same time. I mean, what do I want? Like that key question, what do I want audiences to feel? How do I want them to be different when they come out of this movie? That's the real thing. Movies aren't just entertainment, they're change agents. I think that's my central belief.
What state does the audience need to be in order to receive the message you're sharing with them? And how do you, as the writer, get them into that state?
That's a very good question. They have to be totally focused. And so if a movie is a dream and waking up from the dream is death to the movie, and we all know that, if you find yourself looking at your watch or worrying about the guy who's rustling popcorn or suddenly remembering you left the lights on back home, whatever it was, then the movie dies for that instant. And so your job as a screenwriter is to create a movie in which the plot is so arresting that you remain held in that dream for the whole 100 minutes. Yeah, the best movies, I'm sure you've had this experience as well, Jacob, is like you kind of really do feel you come out and you're waking up from something. Oh my God, something just happened to me there. And it's not just that I was entertained for a couple of hours, it's that I was changed in those hours. That's what we're aiming for.
Absolutely. Like you said, I think I heard a James Cameron quote somewhere very similar to what you're saying, where he's like, movies aren't just about selling popcorn. Like there's so much more to the meaning to what we're doing and like the imbuing them with meaning. How do you make sure, because you talked about how the meaning has to be embedded, like it's something below the surface. How do you make sure it stays below the surface and it doesn't bubble up and start to dominate the story?
Yeah, and you're not preaching. Yeah, I know. Really hard, and I don't know how to answer that, except that you have to feel it. When I was talking to you about Phil's story and to Brooke, we were both kind of for a moment we were feeling that. Yes, it's about kind of you harness all this authentic detail. The reason that I actually go back to history a lot is that when you find a historical period, you can actually find a world that is coherent. If you're making up a fantasy world, it's very easy for the fantasy to become incoherent because you're just making up these rules for the world. You can make up what you like. And so it's very easy for people to you know, fall off the raft and, they go, okay, I don't believe any of that because those two things are clearly completely incompatible and that's all wrong. If you if you really immerse yourself in the research, another film I've been working on recently is about the Phoenician Empire, which we know very little about, but there are historical theories about how that great trading empire in the Levant worked. So you read everything you can about that and you create a world that is coherent. You know the rules of the world, you know the kind of the economics of it, you know the politics of it, you know the status of women in it, and all of these things. And then you put that into your story. And if you're writing with if you're making it coherent so there are no logical flaws in it, you're not making it melodramatic so that you're not jumping from one thing to a completely kind of over the top consequence. Each of these little blocks, so these little 3-minute blocks has a non-melodramatic kind of consequence that is still kind of arresting and logical, but it's not just pulled out of your head, you know? Yeah, then the next trick is to feel it. And when I talked about you write, so what I do is I carefully write this synopsis, and then I try and lose myself in the story by feeling it. That's hard work as well. It's using a lot of brain power. But unless you're authentically feeling it, then it's not going to have emotional resonance. And somehow, I don't know how, but that thing of emotional resonance and meaning are really closely linked. So if you're writing it and you're feeling it emotionally, then it's going to have a meaning. And you can, if it doesn't have meaning and it doesn't have emotion, then you can approach that problem from either end. You can go, why am I feeling it? Why am I feeling for these characters? You can analyze that. And then or else you can go, what should the meaning of this story be? And am I delivering that? And you can analyze it that way. So you can analyze it intuitively or logically. And weirdly, you get the same answer.
Is the reason when you're kind of writing freely that the meaning emerges because when you're writing freely, your subconscious will just naturally filter in the things you care about into that story as you're writing it?
It will. Yeah, yeah. You notice when you're telling a story out loud, you do that as well. So if you read a book and I then say, tell me the story, there's something about, and I do this all the time with my synopsis. So once I got the story sort of worked out in my head, then I try and tell it to as many people as possible. And I believe Charlie Chaplin used to do this at dinner parties in order to work out the plots, work out whether his films were working emotionally. You just try and keep a dinner party entertained for 45 minutes with the story of your film. That's a really hard, tell a story for 45 minutes, make people laugh and cry, and make them listen to you for that whole length of time without kind of going to the bathroom or asking for what's dessert. That's a really hard ask. And so, but that's the bar. That's where you have to get to as a film writer. And when you can do that, then you're ready to write the script. But like to be able to do that implies that the plot is free of holes, that everything is consequential, and that the people you're telling this story to are sufficiently invested with these characters that they'll want to know what happens next. So when I'm teaching film writing, I often will do that as an exercise. I'll say, "Look, I'm going to tell you a story I made up. Tell me when to stop." And the point of the exercise is I'm going to make me want to tell you right to the end of the story, because once you've heard the first three beats, you'll have to know what happens next. But that's again, you know, these tests. I think these tests of a story's integrity and its value um, are kind of indicative of how hard screenwriting is, because that is a really, if you just set that as a challenge to anyone, keep this little group of people completely arrested for 45 minutes. It's not easy to do. And you need to tell, in order to do it, you need to tell the story not just logically, but also emotionally. And in making it emotional, you'll kind of stimulate some notion of what its meaning is.
And you're telling people your story, you said, before you even written the script.
Yeah. Well, actually, with that one, with the one that I tend to use, it's a kind of spec script that I wrote a long time ago, but it works well in that exercise.
When you're telling people your stories, I'm sure they're giving you certain feedback, whether that be a verbal feedback or just the way you can see them react. How do you make sure you don't bring in too much noise and feedback into the process when you go to start writing that story?
Well, from their reaction, you like that is this great feedback loop that we have where, when I'm telling you a story, I can tell immediately when you're arrested by what I'm saying and when you're just kind of glazing over. That's the that's the great value of telling stories out loud. And again, one of my deeply held beliefs is that storytelling began in the ancient world as a verbal medium. That's how we're programmed both to deliver and to receive stories. And that probably we talked right at the beginning about how far filmmaking technology has gone from that simple requirement. So we've talked about Marvel movies, the way that actually all the flashing and banging and the kind of and CGI and so forth can be used as a distraction from actual storytelling. The test of any of these stories is, can you tell it around a campfire? Name any of your favorite movies, like, whatever. So Jaws, Alien, I could tell you that story around a campfire and keep you on the edge of your seat. A lesser movie, I can't do that well.
It's like I was speaking with John Seal a couple weeks ago, and his son shot a movie. It was very technically well done, and he showed it to Anthony Minghella. And Anthony went, "This shows me you can shoot a film really well technically, but now make a movie with two people against a brick wall and make me cry." Like, that was his feedback. I'm curious with this whole conversation around meaning. When you get brought on to write the physical script of Fury Road, because I know they just had storyboards when you were brought on, how does where does meaning come in on that process? Because I feel like George and Brendan would have imbued it with so much.
Yeah, so just to explain that, Fury Road, George and Brendan McCarthy, who's a great writer, comic book writer, had sat down, and over a year while I was working on Happy Feet downstairs, they were upstairs working on Fury Road, so, and I'd occasionally come up to visit and have a cup of coffee and chat about what they were doing. And then at this point, George said, "Look, we actually need you, John, to write this out as a script, because we've got all these storyboards with bits of dialogue tacked on as the little post-it notes. Write that out as a script." That's actually quite a challenge, because there's so much information, and this storyboard was now the whole film. So these were postcard-sized kind of storyboards for the entire movie, and like every say 20 seconds of the movie had a picture attached to it. It's a really inefficient way to make a movie, as we discovered, and inefficient in that, if you change, for instance, there were sort of, I think at one point there were 5 wives, and George decided he needed 6 wives. That means you need to go through all the pictures with the girls in the back and put in another head. So Mark Sexton, who would do the storyboard, is going nuts, got to try to keep up with these sort of changes. And whereas a script is, by contrast, a much more flexible thing. And then writing down as a script, and I've got to say, George wasn't very happy with the script that I wrote, because he and Brendan had felt, I think, subtext and emotion in this story, which when I just wrote down, "I'm going to write you in 100 pages what you've got on the wall," it's not necessarily there. There's an interesting difference between a visual vocabulary and a and a written vocabulary, because screenwriting is kind of like writing poetry, where in that, even though it's very concise, you're hopefully conveying emotion in the writing. So what George did eventually was I think he took that script with the storyboards down the facing page, and he gave that to Warner's, and that kind of released the next chunk of money for development. But yeah, really interesting exercise. If only to show how, um, you know, even a really detailed storyboard can be quite empty of meaning, whereas a script, strangely, can imply all sorts of felt things in a way that just pictures can't. And clearly, performances can convey all of that subtextual stuff as well. But I learned a lot from doing that because we talk a lot about the visual language of films, but I think it's probably a much more literary medium than filmmakers think.
It's very counter to what they say where a picture's worth 1,000 words, but yet you had to distill 3,500 pictures down into 3,000 words, so or 30,000 words.
Exactly, yeah. And if you had been a look, and I've got to say, I think Fury Road is a masterpiece, and I was there in Cannes when it was first screened, sitting along from George, and the audience gave it a standing ovation. At the end of the first, that the thing what for the film, there was like roars of applause, kind of at the end of the first big action sequence, and everyone was absolutely kind of like pumped. So look, it succeeded amazingly well, that movie, but it did teach me, I think, yeah, that writing a script where you've got to feel it, you've got to put the feelings into this kind of poetic language and dialogue is quite a different process from storyboarding. And there's a reason why the storyboarding generally comes after the writing.
How'd you find the emotion in those pictures then? Was it through conversation with George and Brendan, or, like, how did you take these pictures and find that meaning?
Well, I didn't have much. I had to do this quite quickly in just a couple of weeks. And so there wasn't a lot of time to, because what you normally do when you're co-writing or discussing a film is that you'd spend a lot of time talking about the characters, why they're here, what they represent, what they are, And George knows the backstory and the kind of the extended history of that whole Fury Road world really well. But you've got to have the kind of discussions that we had about Happy Feet, where we talk about our own, and this is what you often end up doing when you're co-writing a movie. You talk about your own experiences in relation to the characters. So my own experience of life was I grew up in this rather formal Scottish, trained as a doctor. It was rather formal Scottish education. Edinburgh, where I grew up, was quite a Calvinist town, and so the idea of this and what I did was mid-career abandoned medicine and ran off to join the circus, so in that way, I'm totally on board with Mumble, the penguin, who grows up in this very straight-laced society in which you're supposed to do things this way. And I go, no, fuck that, I'm going to do it that way. And you go up and meet all the Mexicans and go dancing to them. That's much more. So in the normal process of writing, you tell these stories about yourself. It's amazing. I mean, these writing partnerships are amazingly intimate for that reason, because the only way that you can explain the emotion of a transition is generally by talking about yourself. So by the time you've got to the end of the story, you know everything about the person that you're writing with, but you've also attached a really strong emotion to each of these sequences. You've felt them as well as describing them. And so what I encountered with trying to write Fury Road as a script was that I can see these images, but I'd not felt them as part of the creative process.
Yeah, that's interesting, I guess. I never thought, like, the importance of the conversation. It's not just the act of writing, but all that happens around it is where the meaning comes from.
All the stuff and stuff, right? And I think it's why I end up, because I started off as a novelist and a journalist. Film writing is where I ended up, partly because of that. It's such a wonderfully sociable enterprise.
As social as it is, you still end up in your room by yourself, talking to yourself, and your kids complaining.
Well, at some point, you've got to do that other part. So sitting down and actually get the words on the page. Yeah, yeah.
Tell me about then when because I know you worked with George. I think your official title in the role was story consultant on Furiosa. Was that you doing your synopsis that you tend to do
Yeah,
for
that's me doing
that?
my synopsis. So with Furiosa, George sat down, having kind of learned from the Fury Road experience, although he did go on to kind of storyboard, I'm sure, the whole film. But he sat down and said, "Okay, I'm going to tell you a story," and he told me a story over 45 minutes. And I said, "Okay, here's what you've told me," and read him that. So that synopsis exists as a kind of, and I finally kind of went through various iterations of that. So that synopsis of "here's the story you told me" ended up, yeah, being kind of 20 or 30-page document. And then George and his co-writers went off and made that into the script. And it's funny because I watched that film and I felt uh, far less fond of it than I did of Fury Road, because I felt that I don't know, if I felt a lot of those beats had become muddled. And it's interesting that with Happy Feet, actually, because with a complete animation, you have the ability to look at the line drawing version of it quite close to completion. You can see a kind of like a sketched out version of the whole film, and you can make significant changes at that point. So I came in at the very end of the Happy Feet process and revoiced, wrote new dialogue for several scenes to kind of tighten it up a bit, you know. And I think Furiosa would have benefited from that. I came out of that feeling I didn't know what the movie meant, and I don't think it had gone through that final process from a writer's point of view. I've never discussed it with George, but from a writer's point of view, I think it could have done with a little bit of reshaping.
I spoke to Brendan McCarthy, and he felt somewhat like similar to that. I think his feedback was, I think he kind of got down on a side tangent where he was like they should cut Furiosa a little tighter, but then do one big Mad Max mega movie where it's Fury Road and Furiosa is a 4 hour picture, and so that was like where he ended up taking it. But when you were doing that initial synopsis, was that shortly after you'd done the script for Fury Road? Because I know he had the Furiosa idea early, and that was originally going to be an anime. So were you doing like a synopsis for the anime then?
Yeah, I was during that whole year. I was working on. I was employed kind of as an in-house writer by Kennedy Miller Mitchell, and so I was working on Happy Feet and Fury Road and Furiosa. They were all kind of happening simultaneously. And George has got such patience that he kind of like he's a because I'm total kind of short-term gratification. And George is like, so I'm talking about 2003. You know, it's like ages ago. You know, George has kind of got this long view of, okay. So when I think back, he was kind of planning most of his next 20 years output in that period that I was there. You know, he had all of these ideas lined up, and I'm sure he's got another sort of 3 or 4 lined up now. Yeah.
Do you like having multiple projects you're working on, or do you like to steep yourself and immerse yourself in one project at a time?
I think is good. Well, the very nature of the business is you got to have multiple projects, just because it's such a lottery whether things will get made, how they'll get made, who's going to make them. I actually had an amazing year this year because I had 3 films and a series all came out at the same time. But that's kind of a reflection of the randomness of film production prior to that. In the Return, the story about Odysseus that I wrote 30 years ago, is being released in December this year. You know, and then Lee, which I worked on 5 years ago, was released earlier this year, and Monkey Man, which I worked on 4 years ago, I think. And so it's like, yeah, you've got these things, you're juggling all these projects. You do need periods of profound concentration. You know, so it takes about 3 months of just reading about one thing to charge up with all the research for a story. And then certainly each draft will take you 6 weeks, of like just focusing on that one thing. But in the spaces in between, then you have to keep all these other plates spinning if you're going to have a career in this business, because 4 out of 5 plates are going to fall and smash, and one of them will keep going.
And that's 6 weeks. Is that 5 to 10 pages a day, you said, usually?
Yeah, obviously, kind of a discounting weekends, but if you can write, yes, I like to write. When you start writing the script, I like to write pretty quickly, and I don't like scripts to be more than 100 pages, because they always then you'll lose 20 pages in the editing room, and that sucks. So you really want to make it as tight as possible. In writing a draft, you might sort of bash it out in 3 or 4 weeks, but then spend, you know, first get it all down there and then make it good and make it tight and make it poetic and make it meaningful, So a draft will, yeah. But I think that thing of doing lots of background work, doing your research, doing your plotting, getting a really detailed synopsis which builds up from 5 or 10 pages to 20 or 30 pages, and then just going for it, and then seeing what comes out of the other end. That's my process, yeah. And that relatively quick sort of discipline output, you're sort of naturally engage your subconscious, and it starts speaking to you.
And do you have any routines when you're writing a script? Like, do you like to write at a certain time of day? Do you have a tea or something with you? Like, what does the actual routine look like?
I'd procrastinate till 4 o'clock and then panic and write for 3 hours. That's my routine.
I want to read you a quote I found because you mentioned how you were a doctor, novelist, into screenwriting. And I had trying to find this quote I wrote down. It's from the Baltimore Sun in 2003. And the quote is, "Of course, major credit must go to the director and co-writer Peter Weir. But one of his smartest choices was to pick the little-known John Collee as his collaborator on the screenplay." And so I'm curious how the little-known John Collee ended up working with Peter Weir on Master and Commander.
Well, I wanted to show you a book here, which I've just received with it. So anyway, look, the truth of that is, like, this Odysseus story, The Return, which I've mentioned to you, which just came out this year. That was my writing sample. I'd written a novel, I'd written a couple of novels, and I had this one writing sample, which was the story of Odysseus. That writing sample got me the job on Happy Feet and on Master and Commander.
How did they get that writing sample?
That was commissioned for £30,000 by Uberto Pasolini, who has finally just directed it himself. But it only happened because he got Ray Fiennes to sign up to it. And in the same way that Master and Commander only happened, wouldn't have happened without Russell Crowe signing up to it. So, yeah, little known John Collee. I mean, the good thing about my moving to Australia, which seemed like a completely kind of counterintuitive move. My wife's Australian, so we moved here when we started our family, and it seemed like moving to the far side of the world. But the great thing for me about Australia was there were all of these world-class directors and not many writers here, because we have a small population, and so not a huge TV industry. And so when they were looking around for a local writer, and George and Peter were looking around for a local writer with American representation, and they find me. But what I wanted to show you was this little-known book, The Schreiber Theory. Have you seen that?
I haven't.
The Schreiber Theory, a radical rewrite of American film history by David Kippen, Kipen. And Kippen's theory, which I've also heard from the guy who set up the Blacklist, who was talking at the Toronto Film Festival this year. Very charismatic guy. I can't remember his name. Their theory is that the quality of the script is the best predictor of a film's success. And it's kind of obvious, but auteur theory, that the best predictor of film success is the director, it was kind of taken over. But this guy's theory is that the quality of the writing is all about the quality of the writing. So I just discovered this book. I thought it was great. Totally agree with it.
I was gonna say Michael Haig, who's I don't think he's a script consultant, and he was on retainer with Will Smith's production company for a while. I think he once said that you can make a really bad movie from a great script, but you can't make a great movie from a really bad script. So I'm on board with that theory.
I'm on board with that. Yeah.
To circle back to when little known John Collee is now working with Peter Weir and George Miller, do you have imposter syndrome in that moment? Is there pressure for you in that moment? Like, how are you feeling in that period of time?
All right. Look, I was lucky. Both George and Peter are amazingly agreeable and unstarry people. So when I arrived at Peter's place, one of the first things he said to me was, "Okay, tell me how you write a screenplay." Like he'd co-written multiple screenplays. Got to be said of both George and Peter that their best work always has another really good writer co-credited, and their worst pieces don't. So, but they were both endearingly kind of modest about their knowledge of the writing process. And so, look, I was then in my early 40s. So I'd been around the block writing novels and whatever, and quite a lot of TV. And they were both just amazingly agreeable company. So there wasn't, look, I still feel an enormous gratitude to both of them. And I try to kind of mirror that in my attitude to younger writers. I'm often collaborating with people who've got a lot less experience than me, and I try not to be too all-knowing with those guys. And also working with, when Anthony Maras, with whom I made Hotel Mumbai, I'd been a judge on his short film, The Palace, and thought it was really beautiful. It's 20 minutes long, but beautifully directed. And so that's when you know, you pay it forward, don't you? So I guess did Anthony the kind of favor that George and Peter done to me and said, look, I think you're brilliant. I want to work with you. And that was Hotel Mumbai. Yeah.
Are there any common mistakes you see these younger screenwriters make when you're working with them?
Yes. And it's generally flaws of logic and melodrama. Those are the two big ones. Firstly, does this world make logical sense? And secondly, when you write the blocks of your story and write it out as a synopsis, just action, just who does what to whom, do all of these things, are they all kind of conservative? By which I mean, you don't go to the corner shop, you don't have your newspaper, so you pull a gun. I don't do that, like make them all like, what is the logical thing for our character to do next? So we understand why he or she does it. If it's both coherent and logical, then you kind of have got a chance of making something that, I will follow. Then you got to make it emotional and meaningful. And that's where, a lot of people fall over as well. But it's surprising how many plots are neither coherent or logical. And, you can have this beautifully written screenplay where somebody has invested a vast amount of time and energy in building a world, but it actually doesn't make sense. And it's not coherent and it's not logical that the people in the story would do these things. It hasn't been sufficiently explained to me. So, yeah, I guess that's my scientific upbringing talking, make it coherent and logical, make it flawless, just as a progression, and then you've passed the first hurdle.
Why do you think that's a common issue? Like, what is the thing that these young screenwriters or new screenwriters are aspiring to achieve that is leading them to take these paths when writing a screenplay where they're not logical and they're melodramatic?
Well, because we've been kind of, I suppose, there's a belief that it's all about the visual imagination and the crazy kind of tell us something we've never seen before. That's what people are aspiring to. Whereas fundamentally, we want to be told the story we believe in. you know? So, okay, tell me about Bronze Age Greece, but tell me about it in a way that I believe in it, you know? So maybe don't have a sea monster. Maybe have a guy who's fought for Troy, fought in the war of Troy and has got PTSD and is just completely disgusted with what his army have done to this beautiful city and now has to sail all the way home and he's lost half of the men who he brought on this crazy expedition and the voyage is gonna lose the other half and the ship's gonna be wrecked and now he's washed up on his island. How's he gonna feel? And I'm there because it's all real and it's all logical. And it kind of, you know, you start telling me about sea monsters and I'm going, yeah, well, maybe. Depends how you do them. Tell me a real story that I'm in. And, that's not to say that you can't tell it when, that you can't actually take me all the way to the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark and then show me kind of ravenous, kind of Israeli fighting ghosts. And I go, fuck yes, I believe that, because the build-up has been such. I got to know what's in the box, and it's got to be something absurdly crazy. But you took me there. I got to that point over like this thing has been so kind of been such a focus. It's got to have something in it.
It fits within the logic of the story that they have presented to you. Like they built to that versus if it had opened like that, you're probably out of that story immediately.
Right, and I'm flashing back to that picture of the kind of beam of light coming out of the thing, and so that's destroying armies, and I've kind of, I bought into it. I'm there.
Why do you think people get so hung up on the notion of doing something we've never seen before?
Oh, the novelty is definitely at a premium, but nothing is new. So, I mean, that's another thing. Okay, this doesn't fit with conventional structure, but I'm writing a new kind of story. That's generally bullshit. That generally, I think of myself as a furniture maker. There's so many ways to make a chair that will stand up, and most of them have got four legs and a rigid back. Like that is how you make a chair stand up. And there are variations on that. I'm sitting on a swivel chair here, but there are variations, but they're known variations. The idea that somebody could come to me with something I don't recognize as a chair that they tell me is a chair, that's not going to be a chair. It's going to be something else. So, so I do believe that. I believe there are structures that work, and that no matter how much we fight against them, the same kinds of structures will reassert themselves just because, you know, I mean, there's been quite a lot of analysis of this. We used to talk about a three-act structure: 1, 2, 3, problem, complications, resolution. That's how every joke works, how every newspaper article works, how every anecdote works. What's the problem? What are the complications? What are the resolution? And then you can get tricksy about it and go, well, actually, that middle section, the complications, that can have three acts as well. First complication, second complication, third. Okay, so that gives us 5-act structure. But, and there's a way I know that you can take anything and impose this kind of matrix on it that'll give it 5 acts. And maybe that's a funny thing to do. But my experience as a writer is that imposing these formal structures on the thing that you're doing is a really good way of making sure that you don't go off the rails and that you give it, you know, that is instantly recognizable to people. And that's part of what we're doing. We're selling a movie. You have to look at the poster, look at the title, knowing what you're going to see. And yeah, so we need to be working within. I do think you know, both the way the brain works, the way we've been sort of taught to read and receive stories is ancient. As I said at the beginning, it goes way back to storytellers wandering around telling us the great epics, and those stories were told in a certain way, and that way still works. And so, yeah, my advice to young screenwriters is generally don't try and invent the wheel. Copy something, and when you copy it, it will become a completely original work of art. So all the novels, they've written 3 novels. They all started off, I thought, well, how do you write? And one of them was actually based on Ripley's Game, the Patricia Highsmith book. I just tear that apart. How do you make that first person narrative work? Okay, I'm going to do that in my book. And it comes out as something completely unrecognizable as anything Patricia Highsmith would have done because it's mine, but it's following her rules, if you like.
How do you balance that and make sure you don't end up with something like we kind of talked about at the beginning, where you've made a script or a movie that's just kind of stitching together a bunch of scenes from other movies?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Because then you have to tear open your chest and put in your own real feelings, your own real emotions and your own life experience. And that's another thing, often when writers come to me and say, very young people come to me and say, how to become a writer? Uh, My first advice is go and have adventures, like go and do something completely batshit crazy, go and walk to the North Pole, whatever you got to do. But, just get out and experience life in all its richness. Don't think about writing till you've got an opinion, not just an experience, but also an opinion about that experience.
You're telling me we don't need more screenwriters writing about screenwriting?
I think we don't need more screenwriters watching who are students of 20th century film. We need film writers who have had real experiences, and that's actually, when you look at the filmmakers who came out of the Second World War, that was a period that threw everyone's life into chaos. We were forced to reevaluate everything they'd previously experienced. They were put into life and death situations that were completely foreign to them, and created, ironically, this massive burst of completely authentic, felt, emotional experience. And even the great sort of war films that were made subsequent to that derived from that experience. I'm sure that I've never spoken to Robert Rodat, who wrote Saving Private Ryan, but that film felt like it was very strongly based on first-hand accounts, and he found a really brilliant plot, which he probably borrowed that whole idea of looking for a guy who's lost behind enemy lines and won't come home. That's probably an idea he borrowed from somewhere else. But what made it unique and fabulous was every little vignette in that story felt that it had the immediacy of lived experience, didn't it? Like every scene you can imagine from that film felt as someone had lived that. It was totally authentic. And so I'm sure that he must have trolled through all of the great accounts of the Second World War and basically found a structure which would incorporate all of those. And that's quite a different thing from looking back through all the great war films ever made. He's not just trying to pick dramatic scenes. He's picking real life experiences and using them as his raw material. You have to have some of that. Some of that you can get from books, but some of that you have to live. You have to live it. So, when I'm writing about I read a film about Touching the Void, a drama of the mountaineering story, and I went ice climbing to find out what that fear and that precarious nature being balanced on crampons and ice picks actually feels like. And once you've felt it, you can write it. Because what you're doing is putting your own psychological reaction to things into pictures and into poetry. So I think what I would say, uh, what I would say is that younger writers, you need more real life experience and use that, even if you're using it indirectly. And that was actually what a whole half a career in medicine did for me, was that I'd seen a lot of life, death, misery, happiness.
How has the internet changed this, or screenwriting, I guess, in general?
It's made research much easier. For instance, if I want to write about the Second World War on the Normandy landings, I can just do da da da, and I'll get pages and pages of first-hand accounts of the Normandy landings. If I want to find, I use Abe Books, which is a second-hand bookshop. I use that a lot for research. It's an internet linking all the secondhand bookshops of the world together. And so you go on there and look for, tell me about the Phoenicians, and I'll get 20 books that I can order online from Amazon about the Phoenicians. And so I'll order all 20 and 5 of them might be pretty good. And then you read all that and suddenly in 3 months you're an expert on the Phoenician Empire. And that's one of the, apart from that, I talked about the social element of screenwriting, but also the joy of just being paid to research stuff is a big part of it as well, And the internet certainly made that easier. But it's also, you do mourn the loss of variety in world culture that it's created. We've all become a little bit homogenous. We've all now got the same visual references. It's harder and harder to go somewhere where people see the world differently.
Yeah, I was hearing someone talk about golf swings and how it is like an example of like just this homogenization of cultures. Like you go back to the 70s and there was guys on the pro tour with like the weirdest swing you've ever seen, but it worked for them. But now we know what a golf swing is supposed to look like, and everyone is just having the same, like closer and closer to the exact same swing. And it's like taking that diversity out of golf, but also like out of culture broadly.
Yeah. So I've always, regarded screenwriting the same way I regarded medicine, was just like a way of having adventures, and so one of my favorite screenwriting adventures was these anthropological filmmakers I know, Martin Brown and Bentley Dean, and they were on a tiny island in Vanuatu, and they called me up and said, "Hey, we're going to make a film here. We need a screenplay." So I said, "I'm there." We end up living in this kind of these grass huts with these kind of hunter-gatherers in the middle of a sort of like tropical forest in Vanuatu. And that got nominated for a Best Foreign Language Oscar, that movie called Tana. That's another bit of advice for screenwriters. It's just whenever you're offered the opportunity to do something weird, then do it, because it's great raw material.
You get no raw material sitting behind the keyboard for the most part.
You generally don't. Yeah, that's right.
John, I really appreciate the time. You've been very generous. Before I let you go, I just want to ask you the last question that I ask everybody at the end of every interview. What does it mean to you to do art well?
To move people, I think. To move people. The objective is to make people laugh and cry. And as I said at the beginning of that, to do it with intentionality, not accidentally making them laugh and cry. But do that intentionally at the moments when you want them to laugh and cry. To transmit emotion with intentionality.
I love that. John, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate this.
No, my pleasure, Jake. It was really good fun. Good questions.
Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast. And if you enjoyed my interview with John, do me a favor and send it to just one friend who you think would like it too. And if you want even more from me, you can subscribe to the Artwell newsletter at the link in the show notes. And now, go do your thing. And whatever it is, do it well.